predicting every NFL team's final record based on the regular season schedule. AFC North, AFC Richmond, AFC North. First team on the slate in the AFC North, Baltimore Ravens. Ravens are an interesting case here. You can never count against Jim Harbaugh or John Harbaugh. Jim's the Michigan guy. John Harbaugh, the head coach. Lamar Jackson's a really talented athlete. They got a handful of running backs to choose from. They're always going to have a good and competitive defense to some degree. So let's go through the Baltimore Ravens schedule 2023. Houston in week 1, automatic win. Week 2, they lose to Cincinnati. Then they beat Indianapolis in week 3. They beat Cleveland in week 4. They lose to Pittsburgh in week 5. They beat Tennessee in week 6. They lose to Detroit in week 7. They beat Arizona in week 8. They lose to Seattle in week 9. They beat Cleveland in week 10. They lose to Cincinnati in week 11. They lose to the Chargers in week 12, but then they beat the Rams in week 14. They beat Jacksonville in week 15. They lose to San Francisco in week 16. They beat Miami in week 17, and they beat Pittsburgh in week 18. All in all, I got that as a 10-7 record for the Baltimore Ravens, which I think is very respectable. They have a handful of gift-wrapped wins coming into this season with Arizona, with Cleveland, twice. Indianapolis is not good. Houston to start the year is garbage. And yeah, those are some gift-wrapped wins. I think 10-7, that could vary, plus or minus 1 win and 1 loss. That could be a 9-8. That could be 11-6. But they're not going to be any more, any less than that. Okay, so Baltimore Ravens at 10-7. Up next in the AFC North, Joe Shiesty, Jamar Chase, Joe Mixon, and the absolutely loaded Cincinnati Bengals just swagged out of their mind. Okay, Bengals 2023 schedule prediction. Week 1 at Cleveland, that's a win. Week 2 at Baltimore, that's a win. Week 2 against the Rams, that's a win. Let me start it over, because I think I counted up the weeks. And I also want to be sure, I just don't immediately jump to conclusions, because week 1 at Cleveland, that's definitely a win for the Bengals. Week 2 at home against Baltimore, which I do think is important. Baltimore is a tough opponent to play at Baltimore, but Cincinnati's at home in week 2. They beat Baltimore. They're also at home week 3 against the Rams, and they'll beat them. Then they go to Tennessee in week 4. That's a win. They go to Arizona in week 5. That's a win. Week 6, again, Seattle, tough opponent to play at Seattle, but they're at home, which is extremely favorable. Such a huge difference for Cincinnati. And because they're at home, they beat Seattle, and they go into their early bye week of week 7, 6-0. They go to San Francisco in week 8. They lose that game. They come back home against Buffalo, and they win that game. Then they play Houston at home, roll through W. They play Baltimore at Baltimore, and I think they win that game also. Then they play Pittsburgh in week 12. They lose that game. They beat Jacksonville on week 13. Indianapolis, week 14, automatic win. They play Minnesota in week 15 at home. That's a win. They play at Pittsburgh in week 16, and they lose again. That's 3. They play at Kansas City in week 17, and they win that game. Then they play Cleveland in week 18, and they win that game. Ultimately come out with 4 losses, 13-4 for the Cincinnati Bengals this year. I think that's accurate. They have a very easy first 5 weeks minus Baltimore, but that's at home. And some of the more intimidating opponents that are non-division opponents, they got extremely beneficial outcomes in terms of home and road. They play at home against Seattle. They play at home against the Rams. Just favorable. So 13-4 for the Bengals. Moving on to Cleveland. I think it's going to be a tough year in Cleveland, but we'll see. 2023 schedule for the Cleveland Browns. Week 1 against Cincinnati, that's a loss. Week 2 against Pittsburgh, that's a loss. Week 3 against Tennessee, they win that game. Okay. Week 4 against Baltimore, that's a loss. Then they have a week 5 bye week. A week 5 bye week. That is crazy. Week 6 against San Francisco, they lose that game. They beat Indianapolis in week 7. They lose to Seattle in week 8. They beat Arizona in week 9. They lose to Baltimore in week 10. So at this point, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 losses. They beat Seattle in week 9. They lose to Baltimore in week 10. They lose to Pittsburgh in week 11. They lose to the Broncos in week 12. They beat the Rams in week 13. They lose to Jacksonville in week 14. They lose to Chicago in week 15. They beat Houston in week 16. They lose to the Jets in week 17. And they lose to Cincinnati in week 18. That puts them with 12 losses. That puts them at 5-12. I think there's not much more you can do with the Cleveland Browns this year. They have talented players on their roster, but ultimately their division is just too tough. And they're seeing other teams improve drastically around them. Kenny Pickett might be solid. We'll get into Pittsburgh here in a second. 5-12 for the Cleveland Browns in 2023. The last team in the AFC North, Pittsburgh Steelers. 2023 schedule prediction for the Pittsburgh Steelers is as follows. Week 1, San Francisco, that's a loss. They play Cleveland in week 2, they beat them. They play Vegas in week 3, they beat them. They play Houston at Houston in week 4, they beat them. Then they play Baltimore, they lose to Baltimore. Bye week in week 6, they play the Rams in week 7, they beat them. They play Jacksonville in week 8, that's a loss. They play Tennessee in week 9, they beat them. Then they play Green Bay in week 10, they beat them. They play Cleveland in week 11, they beat them. At Cincinnati in week 12, that's a loss. They beat Arizona in week 13. They beat New England in week 14. They beat Indianapolis in week 15. Then they go Cincinnati, Seattle, and Baltimore to end the season. Loss. Scuffling 3 straight, but 10-7 gets them into the postseason. 10-7 for the Pittsburgh Steelers this year. I think they're a good enough club. I like 10-7 for them. Kenny Pickett looks like he's drastically improved. Mike Tomlin is an incredibly gifted head coach. He never finishes under 500 ever as a head coach. So I got 10-7 for Pittsburgh Steelers. All in all, recapping the AFC North, I think I had the Bengals at 13-4. I think I had the Ravens at 10-7, Pittsburgh at 10-7, and the Cleveland Browns at 5-12. I think that's going to be pretty darn accurate in the AFC North.